So, at this broad level of generalities, are we for or against reforms? Right? Regrettably, too many people on the left think that being against reforms is some kind of an indicator of being revolutionary. Being against reforms is an indicator of being a schmuck. Right? I want to be very clear. Being against reforms, I don't often say something like that, but this is, being against reforms is an indicator of being a callous human being, if you really know what you're saying. Now, most people who say they're against their reforms haven't thought about what they're saying. What they're saying is, I'm against fighting to end the war. That's a reform. I'm against fighting for higher wages. I'm against fighting for, new policies, affirmative action. I'm against fighting for, and now it's fill in the blank, whatever you want. I'm against fighting for redistributing wealth. I'm against, on and on and on. I'm against all that, because after all of that isn't revolutionary. Right? And therefore I'm against it, because I want to be a revolutionary. Okay, there's either a very severe confusion at work, or there's a very serious callousness. By callousness I mean people are suffering. These changes are needed so that people suffer less. And to be callous to that is incredible. And to then think you're going to organize people? Mind-boggling. Okay, so one can't be against reforms, but what is one against? There is something lurking here that makes sense. Well, one's against reformism. And this is the strategic point. The strategic point is you have to fight for reforms. Because everything you fight for, short of some point in the future when you're literally transforming the society, is a reform. So you have to fight for reforms, but you don't want to do it in a way which is subversive of the desire to win a new society. In fact, you want to do the opposite. You want to fight for reforms in a way which contributes to the process of winning a new society. So you want to fight for reforms, whatever it might be, in a way which, when you win, yields a constituency and structures that are conducive to fighting for more and that make you stronger. And that's the crucial dimension, sort of non-reformist reforms. Fighting for reforms in a manner which contributes to the process that you're part of. To not fight for reforms, to say you're against reforms, disaster. To fight for reforms in a way that's reformist, that causes people to want to go home at the end instead of to continue, also disaster. So to fight for it in a way, so what does that mean? It means it has to raise consciousness. If you're fighting for higher wages, great, but you talk about equitable remuneration, or whatever you talk about, whatever it is you believe in. If you find, and so in other words, you're raising desires for much more than you're immediately fighting for. You can fight against a war on grounds that it is a bad thing. You can fight against a war because you're against imperialism. You can fight against the war because you're against capitalism. You have to know how to talk, so it isn't alienating, but you want to do it in a desirable way. Now, one last thing about reforms, and then I'll move on from that. The attitude that those who are reformists are, by virtue of that, inferior to those of us who are revolutionaries, care less about humanity than those of us who are revolutionaries, are less courageous than those of us who are revolutionaries, is also a pile of crap. Right? Just look out there in society. There are countless people who work in soup kitchens, right, who exhibit oftentimes way more human concern for other people in society than a shitload of revolutionaries who I know. Right? There's a whole lot of back-patting that is not deserved. One can honestly feel that there is no alternative. One can honestly feel that maybe there's an alternative, but we can't win it. And I'm going to devote myself to making things as good as I can within the framework of what I think is possible and be a good person. That doesn't mean one is a sellout. That doesn't mean one is a capitalist toad. Right? It doesn't mean those things. And once we understand that, it will be a whole lot easier for us to deal with people with whom we disagree on this issue, which is fine, because we don't have to disrespect them, because they don't deserve disrespect. Okay, Bill Clinton, the reformist, deserves disrespect, but that's not what we're talking about. Right? We're talking about something different. We're talking about caring human beings who are trying to make life better for other people, but aren't revolutionaries. Well, I'll take them over a whole lot of revolutionaries if I've got to be in a room and have somebody at my back or at my front or whatever. And we need to understand that. Okay, reform. Seeds of the future in the present. All anarchists say that they're for that. It has to mean something. These rhetorical slogans are real if we give them real weight. So seeds of the future in the present has a clear-cut meaning. We don't have to spend any much time on it here. Our organization should reflect our values. But there's one implication of this. Suppose we really want classlessness. Suppose that means we really understand, in IOPS, for example, that, well, you can't have owners. And it also means you don't want, ultimately, a coordinator class of 20% ruling over 80%. Suppose it means that. Well, suppose we look at our own institutions. What are our own institutions? Well, our media institutions, our organization, and our movement. Do we have classlessness internally or not? When you look around, and you'll see we don't. We typically have, not an owner, but I'll tell you what we actually typically have. We have a fundraiser. Right? If you look at most people don't know this, but if you look at most left institutions and organizations, like media organizations, and so on and so forth, you'll find that either the donor, not an owner, but the donor, or the chief fundraiser has the corner office. That's what you'll find. That is not a very large shift from the owner having the corner office. Right? And then, if you look further, you'll find that the people who have the monopoly on the empowering work, the editors or whatever, govern the day. And also earn more, incredibly. Just take a look around. Go visit Verso. Take a look at how it's organized. Okay. Power and elections. This is a good example of one of those things where somebody will say, well, elections suck. Anybody who participates in elections or relates to elections is a fool who's being led around by the nose. No. Yes, elections have all sorts of problems. Yes, elections can have all sorts of damaging implications, of course. But there are times when elections make good sense. Maybe we just had an election in here for some reason. Maybe, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to understand and have a nuanced understanding that is contextual. In some places, elections make a lot of sense. In other places, they don't. We can talk about that later. Violence. Should we rule out violence? I don't know who I'm talking to. Right? Alternatively, I might say, should we rule in violence? Right? So there are those who would say, well, violence is absolute necessity, and we have to put a sort of an onus, a burden of proof on behaving in a nonviolent fashion. Alternatively, somebody might say we have to put a burden of proof on behaving in a nonviolent fashion. Or somebody might say, rule it out entirely. It's contextual. There's a strike. Scabs are coming. Do you block the scabs? Most pacifists, nonviolent folks, will say yes. Well, that's going to be violent. So there are contexts in which different kinds of approaches make sense. And what do? You have to look and see, in context, does a particular tactic, this is what strategy is about, does a particular tactic contribute to the process that's unfolding? So the black bloc. Instead of the discussion being some principled discussion about violence, which makes no sense, or being a discussion about you can't beat the police without ultimately fighting against the police, which doesn't make much sense, it has to be about, in the context of the current situation, is the choice of activity going to yield more people or less people, and more commitment or less commitment in the future? And let me just address this one step further, depending upon who's in the room and what people's views are. Two examples. The Intifada in Palestine. But for a long time it was nonviolent. And slowly but surely, understandably, much like the civil rights movement in the South in the United States, getting smashed, getting hit, getting pummeled, aroused anger and fury, understandably. And finally that fury broke out in return violence, pathetically weak, throwing rocks, etc., against the Israeli military. But the effects you have to look at because they're more subtle. The effects were that the presence of women disintegrated in the Intifada. The presence of children disintegrated. The presence of old people disintegrated. All that was deeply involved and active, and all just gone. And now you had young men hurling rocks. And that was the beginning of the disaster. And so that's what it means to ask about the thing. Not is it morally justified? Were they morally justified to fight back against, Israeli thugs? Sure. That's never an important question. Because nobody is ever proposing something that's morally unjustified, or very rarely, right? In 1969, I would talk in front of big audiences about anti-war movements, and somebody would always invariably raise their hand and say, would you burn down a library to end the war? Right? This was supposed to be a way of trapping you. And my answer was always, in a second, right? In a half a second, in a millisecond. Of course I would burn down a fucking library to end a war that's going to kill 2 million people. Wouldn't you? And then I would say, but of course, in the real world, returning to the real world, burning down a library not only wouldn't help the Vietnamese, it would hurt the Vietnamese. And so, despite the fact that it's warranted, despite the fact that if it would work, I would do it, I would not dream of doing it because it won't work. Because it will do nothing constructive for anybody. And that's the right kind of calculation. And so now what do we come to regarding violence in a country like, say, England or the United States? What we come to is this. It's futile. There is no such thing as a left in a developed country fighting against the police and the military. It is not going to happen. It will not happen. It is inconceivable that we will mount a military opposition to police and army that will in any way disrupt or stop them. It's not going to happen. The disparity is too huge. So what can you do? You have to disarm them. And how do you disarm them? You organize. In 1969 and 1970 in the United States, there was the Black Panthers that people probably know about. How many of you ever heard of the Blackstone Rangers? There's a street gang in Chicago, like the Crips and the Bloods. Some of you may have heard of them. The Blackstone Rangers were a street gang in Chicago, and they looked around and they said, fighting the cops is absurd. The only thing that we can do with the cops is to join the police force and organize. And that's what they did. And when you run into some, 18-year-old punk who wants to go off into the country and learn how to shoot a .22 and thinks that that's going to contribute to the revolution, you tell him if he's so courageous and he wants to deal with violence, he should go join the police force and organize. Because that's what you really do. The most important organizing in the Vietnam War was people joining the U.S. Army to organize within it. They did the best organizing of anybody, bar none. And the most important in many respects. And the same thing will ultimately hold for things like police forces. All right, so that's some thinking on violence. People will disagree, but strategy entails our mindset. In the United States, there's a slogan, fight the good fight. I don't want to spend too long on this, but it basically means be on the side of the angels, be moral, be able to look at yourself in the mirror. It presumes losing. You understand what in other words, fight the good fight is like, I'm going to fight against a heavyweight champion boxer. Oh, I'm going to lose, but I should fight the good fight before I lose. And that's the mindset of most of the left. Most of the left, deep down inside, now maybe it isn't true for you, but I'll bet it's true for some and maybe a lot of people in this room, doesn't believe we can win. Doesn't really and truly believe it. And if you don't believe you can win, then it doesn't make sense to try hard. Because trying hard, as compared to trying just a little, if there's no difference, if you're going to lose either way, is a waste of time. So you don't try hard. You don't look at yourself and figure out what are my inadequacies and how am I going to make them better. Think of a soccer team which goes out and plays and loses. It comes back and it evaluates its weaknesses, trying to correct them and to go out and do better. The reason it does that is because it believes it has a chance to win. If it has no chance to win, there's no point in wasting any time training. There's no point in wasting any time working. There's no point in trying to get better. For too many of us, we are in this to be on the side of the angels. We're in this to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning. It's not that there's anything wrong with being moral or respecting yourself. Of course that's good. It's just that it's not going to win. The only thing that's going to win is all that plus I'm going to really work my ass off to try and get better and to try and contribute to winning. And the key thing about this is that people out there can feel it. When we talk to them, they can just feel it, whether or not we are just in it as a game and posturing, or whether we're in it because we really, it's our identity, it's our community, as compared to, we think we belong, so mindset. All right, let me get to IOPS a little bit. There's other things to talk about, going on too long. IOPS, how does IOPS fit into any of this? Well, it depends, honestly. If IOPS becomes an organization of thousands of people, and those thousands of people don't have a line, don't agree on everything by any means, but have a shared view about vision and about key components of strategy and analysis, and develop the capacity to talk about that and to communicate that, and develop the capacity to help movements and to contribute to movements and to provide support, and develop the capacity to have program. So for instance, maybe IOPS has a program of seeking full employment, not in the UK, but in every country in the world. So there's an international program. Or maybe, remember the corporate globalization movement, the anti-corporate globalization movement. So maybe IOPS has a movement around media. And the IOPS campaign around media is a campaign which is about coercing, forcing, demanding, and pushing for, from media, certain changes. Like, for instance, a labor section of the paper, or a women's section of the paper, run by who? The labor movement or the women's movement in the relative society, in the society. And one can go on. Point is, IOPS can perhaps generate good ideas, good practice, and coherence. A framework in which it's possible for people who differ on certain things to nonetheless work together and to continue to grow and develop, and to overcome things like sectarianism and the kind of posturing that leads to people feeling inadequate because they're not willing to throw rocks, or et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we can deal with a lot of that. Maybe we can provide a model that begins to affect other movements and other organizations and how they operate. That's certainly a good part of my minimalist hope for IOPS. You can imagine what my maximalist hope for IOPS is. But why don't we open up the discussion? I'm happy to, if you have more specific questions, that was all very general, or if you have more general things that you want to talk about. I mean, things like, plant the seeds of the future in the present means you don't have democratic centralism in your organization. It means you don't have coordinated class rule in your, there's all sorts of implications of the things that I brought up as you apply them in practice. Anybody want to explore anything in particular? Or about IOPS? No. Yeah.
I find it quite hard to imagine what the first projects will be and how it feels like there's quite a psychological barrier to getting stuff going from the grassroots. And
it's quite a psychological barrier to what?
Well, I agree with everything on the IOPS website, and then I realised it's really hard to think what I do in IOPS that I wouldn't be doing outside it, even if I think being part of something global is good. So I was just wondering, what kind of things are already going on, or what people envision.
Lots and lots of people have your concern, or variants on your concern, and they sort of. The question is sort of, what can we do that's real? Why is it's just what is it? It's just I work in my immigration campaign or my local housing campaign or this, that, or the other thing. What's IOPS add to all of that? What's the need? And the answer, I think, or at least my answer, would be this. First of all those other things that you do are totally consistent with IOPS. So it's not as if you have to do tons more. You're doing things that are totally, they're fine. Second, most of those efforts are single-issue efforts. They are, maybe not in your case, but in general, most movements are focused. They're addressing some issue or some problem, which is good, but they aren't providing the overarching approach and strategy and vision that's going toward a new society. So what IOPS adds is for people to share in that and to develop that, and for the organizations that the people are in, hopefully, the spreading of that into those organizations. So let me, again, going back to the 60s, at a particular moment in time, the anti-war movement was getting money from donors, and it was getting this much a year. And the civil rights movement was getting this, or this. And there was nothing overarching. There was just anti-war movement, civil rights movement. Right? And so it never even occurred to anybody, or at least almost anybody, that something should happen. I.e., the anti-war movement should distribute large sums that it was getting over to the civil rights movement. Because the only reason the anti-war movement was getting it was because the fundraisers for the anti-war movement were white. And also had the mannerisms and the styles that we've been talking about that the donors could relate to. So they're getting it for all sorts of crappy reasons as compared to going to the civil rights, but never did it ever occur to anybody that, well, okay, it should be we should redistribute some wealth. See, we talk about redistribution, but it never occurs to us to do it ourselves inside of our own where we have some wealth. So we should redistribute. Now, let's say it was happened, right? Suppose it had happened. Well, the totally warranted mistrust of white activism by black activism would have been, if not entirely eradicated in a minute, certainly tremendously reduced by that real act, instead of whites getting up and saying, we love you, with no substance, right? So that's one kind of thing, that an organization which has an overarching perspective about all of it, and is trying to find the interconnections of all of it, and is trying to develop a program that crosses all those interconnections, that's the kind of contribution it can make. Not just that it does something, but that it communicates to movements things that can be done. And then hopefully win the day. Those things win the day inside those movements. So that's something that it can do. I don't think that by and large those movements, or really very many, have anything like the visionary commitments of IOPS. So if you believe that countering TINA matters, and I think countering TINA, the idea that there's an alternative, not only matters, but maybe the paramount step to actually developing massive movements of a third of the population, then an organization which shares and develops a counter to TINA and becomes adept at communicating it is making a big contribution. So when people ask me, well, what can I do now? Well, you can't work on the IOPS project to transform international media, because it doesn't exist yet. You can't work on the IOPS project to redistribute wealth because it doesn't exist yet. So those things don't yet exist. What you can do is join and recruit. Join and grow the organization. Because in the whole life of the history of the organization, if this organization exists from now right through the creation of a new society, and if it's a fundamental component of the creation of a new society, optimistic view of things, still the most important moment in the life history of that organization is going to be the next year. And the most important act is going to be getting more people into it. Because nothing happens without more people, and without those people feeling confidence and feeling part of it. So the thing that people can do is that. And people look at me like I'm a lunatic, and they say, recruit? What's that? Answer? That's revolutionary politics. Getting people, communicating with people, sharing ideas and developing consciousness. That's what it is. That's the most important, difficult step. Running in the streets is trivial. I've done a lot of it. It is trivial compared to communicating and generating human ties and commitments. That's what matters. Anyway, so that's both the kind of thing I think it can contribute, and the reason why I think the current activity, as minimal as it is, right? And as unexciting as it may appear, is very important.